Part 2, Chapter 5, Section 4 of Chance by Joseph Conrad. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Read by Peter Dann. Chance, Part 2, Chapter 5, Section 4. This was, you understand, the voyage before Mr. Powell, young Powell then, joined the Ferndale, Chance having arranged that he should get his start in life in that particular ship of all the ships then in the port of London. The most unrestful ship that ever sailed out of any port on earth. I'm not alluding to her sea-going qualities. Mr. Powell tells me she was as steady as a church. I mean unrestful in the sense, for instance, in which this planet of ours is unrestful, a matter of an uneasy atmosphere disturbed by passions, jealousies, loves, hates, and the troubles of transcendental good intentions, which, though ethically valuable, I have no doubt cause often more unhappiness than the plots of the most evil tendency. For those who refuse to believe in chance, Mr. Powell, must have been obviously predestined to add his native ingenuousness to the sum of all the others carried by the honest ship Ferndale. He was too ingenuous. Everybody on board was, exception being made of Mr. Smith, who, however, was simple enough in his way, with that terrible simplicity of the fixed idea, for which there is also another name men pronounce with dread and aversion. His fixed idea was to save his girl from the man who had possessed himself of her. I use these words on purpose, because the image they suggest was clearly in Mr. Smith's mind. Possessed himself unfairly of her, while he, the father, was locked up. "I won't rest till I have got you away from that man," he would murmur to her after long periods of contemplation. We know from Powell how he used to sit on the skylight near the long deck-chair on which Flora was reclining, gazing into her face from above with an air of guardianship and investigation at the same time. It is almost impossible to say if he ever had considered the event rationally. The avatar of de Barrall into Mr. Smith had not been effected without a shock. That much one must recognise. It may be that it drove all practical considerations out of his mind, making room for awful and precise visions which nothing could dislodge afterwards. And it might have been the tenacity, the unintelligent tenacity of the man who had persisted in throwing millions of other people's thrift into the Lone Valley Railway, the Labrador Docks, the Spotted Leopard copper mine, and other grotesque speculations exposed during the famous de Barrall trial, amongst murmurs of astonishment mingled with bursts of laughter. For it is in the courts of law that comedy finds its last refuge in our deadly serious world. As to tears and lamentations, these were not heard in the august precincts of comedy, because they were indulged in privately, in several thousand homes, where, with a fine dramatic effect, hunger had taken the place of thrift. But there was one at least who did not laugh in court. That person was the accused. The notorious de Barrall did not laugh because he was indignant. He was impervious to words, to facts, to inferences. It would have been impossible to make him see his guilt or his folly, either by evidence or argument, if anybody had tried to argue. Neither did his daughter Flora try to argue with him. The cruelty of her position was so great, its complications so thorny, if I may express myself so, that a passive attitude was yet her best refuge, as it had been before her of so many women. For that sort of inertia in woman is always enigmatic, and therefore menacing. It makes one pause. A woman may be a fool, a sleepy fool, an agitated fool, a too awfully noxious fool, and she may even be simply stupid, but she is never dense. She is never made of wood through and through, as some men are. There is in woman always, somewhere, a spring. Whatever men don't know about women, and it may be a lot or it may be very little, men and even fathers do know that much, and that is why so many men are afraid of them. Mr. Smith, I believe, was afraid of his daughter's quietness, though of course he interpreted it in his own way. He would, as Mr. Powell depicts, sit on the skylight and bend over the reclining girl, wondering what there was behind the lost gaze under the darkened eyelids in the still eyes. He would look and look, and then he would say, whisper rather. It didn't take much for his voice to drop to a mere breath. He would declare, transferring his faded stare to the horizon, that he would never rest till he had got her away from that man. "You don't know what you are saying, Papa." She would try not to show her weariness, the nervous strain of these two men's antagonism around her person, which was the cause of her languid attitudes, for, as a matter of fact, the sea agreed with her. As likely as not, Anthony would be walking on the other side of the deck. The strain was making him restless. He couldn't sit still anywhere. He had tried shutting himself up in his cabin, but that was no good. He would jump up to rush on deck, and tramp, tramp, up and down that poop till he felt ready to drop, without being able to wear down the agitation in his soul, generous indeed, but weighted by its envelope of blood and muscle and bone, handicapped by the brain, creating precise images, and everlastingly speculating, looking out for signs, watching for symptoms. And Mr. Smith, with a slight backward jerk of his small head at the footsteps on the other side of the skylight, would insist in his awful, hopelessly gentle voice that he knew very well what he was saying. Hadn't she given herself to that man while he was locked up? Helpless, in jail, with no one to think of, nothing to look forward to but my daughter. And then, when they let me out at last, I find her gone, for it amounts to this, sold, because you've sold yourself, you know you have." With his round, unmoved face, a lot of fine white hair waving in the wind eddies of the spanker, his glance levelled over the sea, he seemed to be addressing the universe across her reclining form. She would protest sometimes. "I wish you would not talk like this, Papa. You are only tormenting me, and tormenting yourself." "Yes, I am tormented enough," he admitted meaningly. But it was not talking about it that tormented him. It was thinking of it. And to sit and look at it was worse for him than it possibly could have been for her to go and give herself up, bad as that must have been. "For of course you suffered. Don't tell me you didn't. You must have." She had renounced very soon all attempts at protests. It was useless. It might have made things worse, and she did not want to quarrel with her father, the only human being that really cared for her, absolutely, evidently, completely, to the end. There was in him no pity, no generosity, nothing whatever of these fine things. It was for her very own self, such as it was, that this human being cared. This certitude would have made her put up with worse torments, for, of course, she too was being tormented. She felt also helpless, as if the whole enterprise had been too much for her. This is the sort of conviction which makes for quietude. She was becoming a fatalist. What must have been rather appalling were the necessities of daily life, the intercourse of current trifles. That naturally had to go on. They wished good morning to each other, they sat down together to meals, and I believe there would be a game of cards now and then in the evening, especially at first. What frightened her most was the duplicity of her father, at least what looked like duplicity, when she remembered his persistent, insistent whispers on deck. However, her father was a taciturn person, as far back as she could remember him best, on the parade. It was she who chatted, never troubling herself to discover whether he was pleased or displeased. And now she couldn't fathom his thoughts. Neither did she chatter to him. Anthony, with a forced friendly smile as if frozen to his lips, seemed only too thankful at not being made to speak. Mr. Smith sometimes forgot himself while studying his hand so long that Flora had to recall him to himself by a murmured, "Papa, your lead." Then he apologized by a faint as if inward ejaculation, "Beg your pardon, Captain." Naturally she addressed Anthony as Roderick, and he addressed her as Flora. That was all the acting that was necessary to judge from the wincing twitch of the old man's mouth at every uttered Flora. On hearing the rare Rodericks, he had sometimes a scornful grimace, as faint and faded and colourless as his whole stiff personality. He would be the first to retire. He was not infirm. With him, too, the life on board ship seemed to agree, but from a sense of duty, of affection, or to placate his hidden fury, his daughter always accompanied him to his stateroom to make him comfortable. She lighted his lamp, helped him into his dressing-gown, or got him a book from a bookcase fitted in there. But this last rarely, because Mr. Smith used to declare, "I am no reader," with something like pride in his low tones. Very often, after kissing her good night on the forehead, he would treat her to some such fretful remark. "It's like being in jail, upon my word. I suppose that man is out there waiting for you. Head jailer. Oh!" She would smile vaguely, murmur a conciliatory, "How absurd!" But once, out of patience, she said quite sharply, "Leave off, it hurts me. One would think you hate me." "It isn't you I hate," he went on monotonously, breathing at her. "No, it isn't you. But if I saw that you loved that man, I think I could hate you too." That word struck straight at her heart. "You wouldn't be the first then," she muttered bitterly. But he was busy with his fixed idea, and uttered an awfully equable, "But you don't, unfortunate girl." She looked at him steadily for a time, then said, "Good night, Papa." As a matter of fact, Anthony very seldom waited for her alone at the table with the scattered cards, glasses, water-jug, bottles, and so on. He took no more opportunities to be alone with her than was absolutely necessary for the edification of Mrs. Brown. Excellent, faithful woman, the wife of his still more excellent and faithful steward. And Flora wished all these excellent people devoted to Anthony. She wished them all further, and especially the nice, pleasant-spoken Mrs. Brown, with her beady, mobile eyes, and her "Yes, certainly, ma'am," which seemed to her to have a mocking sound. And so this short trip, to the Western Islands only, came to an end. It was so short that when young Powell joined the Ferndale by a memorable stroke of chance, no more than 7 months had elapsed since the, let us say, the liberation of the convict de Barrall and his avatar into Mr. Smith. For the time the ship was loading in London, Anthony took a cottage near a little country station in Essex to house Mr. Smith and Mr. Smith's daughter. It was altogether his idea. How far it was necessary for Mr. Smith to seek rural retreat, I don't know. Perhaps to some extent it was a judicious arrangement. There were some obligations incumbent on the liberated de Barrall, in connection with reporting himself to the police, I imagine, which Mr. Smith was not anxious to perform. De Barrall had to vanish. The theory was that de Barrall had vanished, and it had to be upheld. Poor Flora liked the country, even if the spot had nothing more to recommend it than its retired character. Now and then Captain Anthony ran down, but as the station was a real wayside one, with no early morning trains up, he could never stay for more than the afternoon. It appeared that he must sleep in town so as to be early on board his ship. The weather was magnificent, and whenever the captain of the Ferndale was seen on a brilliant afternoon coming down the road, Mr. Smith would seize his stick and toddle off for a solitary walk. But whether he would get tired, or because it gave him some satisfaction to see "that man" go away, or for some cunning reason of his own, he was always back before the hour of Anthony's departure. On approaching the cottage he would see generally "that man" lying on the grass in the orchard at some distance from his daughter, seated in a chair brought out of the cottage's living-room. Invariably Mr. Smith made straight for them, and as invariably had the feeling that his approach was not disturbing a very intimate conversation. He sat with them through a silent hour or so, and then it would be time for Anthony to go. Mr. Smith, perhaps from discretion, would casually vanish a minute or so before, and then watch through the diamond panes of an upstairs room "that man" take a lingering look outside the gate at the invisible Flora, lift his hat like a caller, and go off down the road. Then only Mr. Smith would join his daughter again. These were the bad moments for her. Not always, of course, but frequently. It was nothing extraordinary to hear Mr. Smith begin gently with some observation like this: "That man is getting tired of you." He would never pronounce Anthony's name. It was always "that man." Generally she would remain mute, with eyes open, eyes gazing at nothing between the gnarled fruit trees. Once, however, she got up and walked into the cottage. Mr. Smith followed her, carrying the chair. He banged it down resolutely, and in that smooth, inexpressive tone so many ears used to bend eagerly to catch when it came from the great de Barrall, he said, "Let's get away." She had the strength of mind not to spin round. On the contrary, she went on to a shabby bit of a mirror on the wall. In the greenish glass her own face looked far off, like the livid face of a drowned corpse at the bottom of a pool. She laughed faintly. "I tell you, that man's getting—" "Papa," she interrupted him, "I have no illusions as to myself. It has happened to me before, but—" Her voice failing her suddenly, her father struck in with quite an unwonted animation. "Let's make a rush for it, then." Having mastered both her fright and her bitterness, she turned around, sat down, and allowed her astonishment to be seen. Mr. Smith sat down too, his knees together and bent at right angles, his thin legs parallel to each other, and his hands resting on the arms of the wooden armchair. His hair had grown long, his head was set stiffly, there was something fatuously venerable in his aspect. "You can't care for him. Don't tell me. I understand your motive, and I have called you an unfortunate girl. You are that as much as if you had gone on the streets. Yes, don't interrupt me, Flora. I was everlastingly being interrupted at the trial, and I can't stand it any more. I won't be interrupted by my own child. And when I think that it is on the very day before they let me out that you—" He had wormed this fact out of her by that time, because Flora had got tired of evading the question. He had been very much struck and distressed. Was that the trust she had in him? Was that a proof of confidence and love? The very day before! Never given him even half a chance. It was as at the trial. They never gave him a chance. They would not give him time. And there was his own daughter acting exactly as his bitterest enemies had done, not giving him time. The monotony of that subdued voice nearly lulled her dismay to sleep. She listened to the unavoidable things he was saying. "But what induced that man to marry you? Of course he's a gentleman, one can see that, and that makes it worse. Gentlemen don't understand anything about city affairs, finance. Why, the people who started the cry after me were a firm of gentlemen. The counsel, the judge, all gentlemen, quite out of it, no notion of— And then he's a sailor too, just a skipper." "My grandfather was nothing else," she interrupted, and he made an angular gesture of impatience. "Yes, but what does a silly sailor know of business? Nothing, no conception. He can have no idea of what it means to be the daughter of Mr. de Barrall, even after his enemies had smashed him. What on earth induced him—" She made a movement because the level voice was getting on her nerves, and he paused, but only to go on again in the same tone with the remark, "Of course you are pretty, and that's why you are lost, like many other girls. Unfortunate is the word for you." She said, "It may be. Perhaps it is the right word. But listen, Papa, I mean to be honest." He began to exhale more speeches. "Just the sort of man to get tired and then leave you and go off with his beastly ship. And anyway, you can never be happy with him. Look at his face. I want to save you. You see, I was not perhaps a very good husband to your poor mother. She would have done better to have left me long before she died. I have been thinking it all over. I won't have you unhappy." He ran his eyes over her with an attention which was surprisingly noticeable, then said, "Yes. Let's clear out before it is too late. Quietly, you and I." She said, as if inspired, and with that calmness which despair often gives, "There is no money to go away with, Papa." He rose up, straightening himself as though he were a hinged figure. She said decisively, "And of course you wouldn't think of deserting me, Papa." "Of course not," sounded his subdued tone. And he left her, gliding away with his walk, which Mr. Powell described to me as being as level and wary as his voice. He walked as if he were carrying a glassful of water on his head. Flora naturally said nothing to Anthony of that edifying conversation. His generosity might have taken alarm at it, and she did not want to be left behind to manage her father alone. And moreover, she was too honest. She would be honest at whatever cost. She would not be the first to speak, never. And the thought came into her head, I am indeed an unfortunate creature. It was by the merest coincidence that Anthony, coming for the afternoon 2 days later, had a talk with Mr. Smith in the orchard. Flora, for some reason or other, had left them for a moment, and Anthony took that opportunity to be frank with Mr. Smith. He said, "It seems to me, sir, that you think Flora has not done very well for herself." "Well, as to that, I can't say anything. All I want you to know is that I have tried to do the right thing." And then he explained that he had willed everything he was possessed of to her. "She didn't tell you, I suppose?" Mr. Smith shook his head slightly, and Anthony, trying to be friendly, was just saying that he proposed to keep the ship away from home for at least 2 years. "I think, sir, that from every point of view it would be best," when Flora came back, and the conversation, cut short in that direction, languished and died. Later in the evening, after Anthony had been gone for hours, on the point of separating for the night, Mr. Smith remarked suddenly to his daughter, after a long period of brooding, "A will is nothing. One tears it up, one makes another." Then, after reflecting for a minute, he added unemotionally, "One tells lies about it." Flora, patient, steeled against every hurt and every disgust to the point of wondering at herself, said, "You push your dislike of Roderick too far, Papa. You have no regard for me. You hurt me." He, as ever inexpressive to the point of terrifying her sometimes by the contrast of his placidity and his words, turned away from her a pair of faded eyes. "I wonder how far your dislike goes," he began. "His very name sticks in your throat. I've noticed it. It hurts me. What do you think of that? You might remember that you are not the only person that's hurt by your folly, by your hastiness, by your recklessness." He brought back his eyes to her face. "And the very day before they were going to let me out." His feeble voice failed him altogether, the narrow, compressed lips only trembling for a time before he added with that extraordinary equanimity of tone, "I call it sinful." Flora made no answer. She judged it simpler, kinder, and certainly safer to let him talk himself out. This, Mr. Smith, being naturally taciturn, never took very long to do. And we must not imagine that this sort of thing went on all the time. She had a few good days in that cottage. The absence of Anthony was a relief, and his visits were pleasurable. She was quieter. He was quieter too. She was almost sorry when the time to join the ship arrived. It was a moment of anguish, of excitement. They arrived at the dock in the evening, and Flora, after making her father comfortable according to established usage, lingered in the stateroom long enough to notice that he was surprised. She caught his pale eyes observing her quite stonily. Then she went out after a cheery good night. Contrary to her hopes, she found Anthony yet in the saloon. Sitting in his armchair at the head of the table, he was picking up some business papers, which he put hastily in his breast pocket and got up. He asked her if her day, travelling up to town and then doing some shopping, had tired her. She shook her head. Then he wanted to know, in a half-jocular way, how she felt about going away, and for a long voyage this time. "Does it matter how I feel?" she asked in a tone that cast a gloom over his face. He answered with repressed violence which she did not expect. "No, it does not matter, because I cannot go without you. I've told you. You know it. You don't think I could?" "I assure you I haven't the slightest wish to evade my obligations," she said steadily, "even if I could, even if I dared, even if I had to die for it." He looked thunderstruck. They stood facing each other at the end of the saloon. Anthony stuttered, "Oh, no, you won't die. You don't mean it. You have taken kindly to the sea." She laughed, but she felt angry. "No, I don't mean it. I tell you I don't mean to evade my obligations. I shall live on, feeling a little crushed, nevertheless." "Crushed?" he repeated. "What's crushing you?" "Your magnanimity," she said sharply. But her voice was softened after a time. "Yet I don't know. There's a perfection in it. Do you understand me, Roderick, which makes it almost possible to bear?" He sighed, looked away, and remarked that it was time to put out the lamp in the saloon. The permission was only till 10 o'clock. "But you needn't mind that so much in your cabin. Just see that the curtains of the ports are drawn close, and that's all. The steward might have forgotten to do it. He lighted your reading lamp in there before he went ashore for a last evening with his wife. I don't know if it was wise to get rid of Mrs. Brown. You will have to look after yourself, Flora." He was quite anxious, but Flora, as a matter of fact, congratulated herself on the absence of Mrs. Brown. No sooner had she closed the door of her stateroom than she murmured fervently, "Yes, thank goodness, she is gone." There would be no gentle knock, followed by her appearance with her equivocal stare and the intolerable "Can I do anything for you, ma'am?" which poor Flora had learned to fear and hate more than any voice or any words on board that ship, her only refuge from the world which had no use for her imperfections, and for her troubles. End of Part 2, Chapter 5, Section 4. Part 2, Chapter 5, Section 5 of Chance by Joseph Conrad. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Read by Peter Dann. Chance, Part 2, Chapter 5, Section 5. Mrs. Brown had been very much vexed at her dismissal. The Browns were a childless couple, and the arrangement had suited them perfectly. Their resentment was very bitter. Mrs. Brown had to remain ashore alone with her rage, but the steward was nursing his on board. Poor Flora had no greater enemy. The aggrieved mate had no greater sympathizer. And Mrs. Brown, with a woman's quick power of observation and inference, the putting of two and two together, had come to a certain conclusion which she had imparted to her husband before leaving the ship. The morose steward permitted himself once to make an allusion to it in Powell's hearing. It was in the officers' mess room at the end of a meal, while he lingered after putting a fruit pie on the table. He and the chief mate started a dialogue about the alarming change in the captain, the sallow steward looking down with a sinister frown, Franklin rolling upwards his eyes, sentimental in a red face. Young Powell had heard a lot of that sort of thing by that time. It was growing monotonous. It had always sounded to him a little absurd. He struck in impatiently with the remark that such lamentations over a man merely because he had taken a wife seemed to him like lunacy. Franklin muttered, "Depends on what the wife is up to." The steward, leaning against the bulkhead near the door, glowered at Powell, that newcomer, that ignoramus, that stranger without right or privileges. He snarled, "Wife! Call her a wife, do you?" "What the devil do you mean by this?" exclaimed young Powell. "I know what I know. My old woman has not been 6 months on board for nothing. You had better ask her when we get back." And meeting sullenly the withering stare of Mr. Powell, the steward retreated backwards. Our young friend turned at once upon the mate. "And you let that confounded bottle-washer talk like this before you, Mr. Franklin? Well, I'm astonished." "Oh, it isn't what you think. It isn't what you think." Mr. Franklin looked more apoplectic than ever. "If it comes to that, I could astonish you. But it's no use. I myself can hardly. You couldn't understand. I hope you won't try to make mischief. There was a time, young fellow, when I would have dared any man, you hear, to make mischief between me and Captain Anthony. But not now. Not now. There's a change. Not in me, though." Young Powell rejected with indignation any suggestion of making mischief. "Who do you take me for?" he cried. "And you'd better tell that steward to be careful what he says before me, or I'll spoil his good looks for him for a month, and will leave him to explain the why of it to the captain the best way he can." This speech established Powell as a champion of Mrs. Anthony. Nothing more bearing on the question was ever said before him. He did not care for the steward's black looks. Franklin, never conversational even at the best of times, and avoiding now the only topic near his heart, addressed him only on matters of duty. And for that, too, Powell cared very little. The woes of the apoplectic mate had begun to bore him long before. Yet he felt lonely a bit at times. Therefore the little intercourse with Mrs. Anthony, either in one dog watch or the other, was something to be looked forward to. The captain did not mind it. That was evident from his manner. One night he inquired, they were then alone on the poop, what they had been talking about that evening. Powell had to confess that it was about the ship. Mrs. Anthony had been asking him questions. "Takes interest, eh?" jerked out the captain, moving rapidly up and down the weather side of the poop. "Yes, sir. Mrs. Anthony seems to get hold wonderfully of what one's telling her." "Sailor's granddaughter, one of the old school. Old sea dog of the best kind, I believe," ejaculated the captain, swinging past his motionless second officer and leaving the words behind him like a trail of sparks succeeded by a perfect conversational darkness, because for the next 2 hours till he left the deck he didn't open his lips again. On another occasion, we mustn't forget that the ship had crossed the line and was adding up south latitude every day by then. On another occasion, about 7 in the evening, Powell, on duty, heard his name uttered softly in the companion. The captain was on the stairs, thin-faced, his eyes sunk, on his arm a Shetland wool wrap. "Mr. Powell, here." "Yes, sir." "Give this to Mrs. Anthony. Evenings are getting chilly." And the haggard face sank out of sight. Mrs. Anthony was surprised on seeing the shawl. "The captain wants you to put this on," explained young Powell, and as she raised herself in her seat he dropped it on her shoulders. She wrapped herself up closely. "Where was the captain?" she asked. "He was in the companion. Called me on purpose," said Powell, and then retreated discreetly, because she looked as though she didn't want to talk any more that evening. Mr. Smith, the old gentleman, was as usual sitting on the skylight near her head, brooding over the long chair, but by no means inimical, as far as his unreadable face went, to those conversations of the 2 youngest people on board. In fact, they seemed to give him some pleasure. Now and then he would raise his faded china eyes to the animated face of Mr. Powell thoughtfully. When the young sailor was by, the old man became less rigid, and when his daughter, on rare occasions, smiled at some artless tale of Mr. Powell, the inexpressive face of Mr. Smith reflected dimly that flash of evanescent mirth. For Mr. Powell had come now to entertain his captain's wife with anecdotes from the not very distant past when he was a boy on board various ships. Funny things do happen on board ship. Flora was quite surprised at times to find herself amused. She was even heard to laugh twice in the course of a month. It was not a loud sound, but it was startling enough in the after end of the Ferndale, where low tones or silence were the rule. The second time this happened, the captain himself must have been startled somewhere down below, because he emerged from the depths of his unobtrusive existence and began his tramping on the opposite side of the poop. Almost immediately he called his young second officer over to him. This was not done in displeasure. The glance he fastened on Mr. Powell conveyed a sort of approving wonder. He engaged him in desultory conversation, as if for the only purpose of keeping a man who could provoke such a sound near his person. Mr. Powell felt himself liked. He felt it. Liked by that haggard, restless man who threw at him disconnected phrases to which his answers were, "Yes, sir," "No, sir," "Oh, certainly," "I suppose so, sir," and might have been clearly anything else, for all the other cared. It was then, Mr. Powell told me, that he discovered in himself an already old-established liking for Captain Anthony. He also felt sorry for him, without being able to discover the origins of that sympathy of which he had become so suddenly aware. Meantime, Mr. Smith, bending forward stiffly as though he had a hinged back, was speaking to his daughter. She was a child no longer. He wanted to know if she believed in hell, in eternal punishment. His peculiar voice, as if filtered through cotton wool, was inaudible on the other side of the deck. Poor Flora, taken very much unawares, made an inarticulate murmur, shook her head vaguely, and glanced in the direction of the pacing Anthony, who was not looking her way. It was no use glancing in that direction. Of young Powell leaning against the mizzen-mast and facing his captain, she could only see the shoulder and part of a blue serge back. And the unworried, unaccented voice of her father went on tormenting her. "You see, you must understand, when I came out of jail it was with joy. That is, my soul was fairly torn in two, but anyway, to see you happy, I had made up my mind to that. Once I could be sure that you were happy, then of course I would have had no reason to care for life, strictly speaking, which is all right for an old man, though naturally no reason to wish for death either. But this sort of life, what sense, what meaning, what value has it either for you or for me? It's just sitting down to look at the death that's coming. What else is it? I don't know how you can put up with that. I don't think you can stand it for long. Some day you will jump overboard." Captain Anthony had stopped for a moment, staring ahead from the break of the poop, and poor Flora sent at his back a look of despairing appeal which would have moved a heart of stone. But as though she had done nothing, he did not stir in the least. She got out of the long chair and went towards the companion. Her father followed, carrying a few small objects, a handbag, a handkerchief, a book. They went down together. It was only then that Captain Anthony turned, looked at the place they had vacated, and resumed his tramping, but not his desultory conversation with his second officer. His nervous exasperation had grown so much that now, very often, he used to lose control of his voice. If he did not watch himself, it would suddenly die in his throat. He had to make sure before he ventured on the simplest saying, an order, a remark on the wind, a simple good morning. That's why his utterance was abrupt, his answers to people startlingly brusque, and often not forthcoming at all. It happens to the most resolute of men to find himself at grips not only with unknown forces, but with a well-known force, the real might of which he had not understood. Anthony had discovered that he was not the proud master, but the chafing captive of his generosity. It rose in front of him like a wall, which his respect for himself forbade him to scale. He said to himself, "Yes, I was a fool, but she has trusted me." Trusted. A terrible word to any man somewhat exceptional in a world in which success has never been found in renunciation and good faith. And it must also be said, in order not to make Anthony more stupidly sublime than he was, that the behaviour of Flora kept him at a distance. The girl was afraid to add to the exasperation of her father. It was her unhappy lot to be made more wretched by the only affection which she could not suspect. She could not be angry with it, however, and out of deference for that exaggerated sentiment she hardly dared to look otherwise than by stealth at the man whose masterful compassion had carried her off. And quite unable to understand the extent of Anthony's delicacy, she said to herself that he didn't care. He probably was beginning at bottom to detest her, like the governess, like the maiden lady, like the German woman, like Mrs. Fine, like Mr. Fine. Only he was extraordinary. He was generous. At the same time she had moments of irritation. He was violent, headstrong, perhaps stupid. Well, he had had his way. A man who has had his way is seldom happy, for generally he finds that the way does not lead very far on this earth of desires which can never be fully satisfied. Anthony had entered with extreme precipitation the enchanted gardens of Armida, saying to himself, "At last." As to Armida herself, he was not going to offer her any violence. But now he had discovered that all the enchantment was in Armida herself, in Armida's smiles. This Armida did not smile. She existed, unapproachable, behind the blank wall of his renunciation. His force, fit for action, experienced the impatience, the indignation, almost the despair of his vitality arrested, bound, stilled, progressively worn down, frittered away by time, by that force blind and insensible which seems inert and yet uses one's life up by its imperceptible action, dropping minute after minute on one's living heart like drops of water wearing down a stone. He upbraided himself. What else could he have expected? He had rushed in like a ruffian. He had dragged the poor defenceless thing by the hair of her head, as it were, on board that ship. It was really atrocious. Nothing assured him that his person could be attractive to this or any other woman, and his proceedings were enough in themselves to make anyone odious. He must have been bereft of his senses. She must fatally detest and fear him. Nothing could make up for such brutality. And yet, somehow, he resented this very attitude which seemed to him completely justifiable. Surely he was not too monstrous, morally, to be looked at frankly sometimes. But no, she wouldn't. Well, perhaps some day. Only he was not going ever to attempt to beg for forgiveness. With the repulsion she felt for his person, she would certainly misunderstand the most guarded words, the most careful advances. Never, never. It would occur to Anthony at the end of such meditations that death was not an unfriendly visitor after all. No wonder then that even young Powell, his faculties having been put on the alert, began to think that there was something unusual about the man who had given him his chance in life. Yes, decidedly, his captain was strange. There was something wrong somewhere, he said to himself, never guessing that his young and candid eyes were in the presence of a passion, profound, tyrannical, and mortal, discovering its own existence, astounded at feeling itself helpless, and dismayed at finding itself incurable. Powell had never before felt this mysterious uneasiness so strongly as on that evening when it had been his good fortune to make Mrs. Anthony laugh a little by his artless prattle. Standing out of the way, he had watched his captain walk the weather side of the poop. He took full cognizance of his liking for that inexplicably strange man, and saw him swerve towards the companion and go down below with sympathetic, if utterly uncomprehending eyes. Shortly afterwards, Mr. Smith came up alone and manifested a desire for a little conversation. He, too, if not so mysterious as the captain, was not very comprehensible to Mr. Powell's uninformed candour. He often favoured thus the second officer. His talk alluded somewhat enigmatically, and often without visible connection, to Mr. Powell's friendliness towards himself and his daughter. "For I am well aware that we have no friends on board this ship, my dear young man," he would add, "except yourself. Flora feels that too." And Mr. Powell, flattered and embarrassed, could but emit a vague murmur of protest, for the statement was true in a sense, though the fact was in itself insignificant. The feelings of the ship's company could not possibly matter to the captain's wife and to Mr. Smith, her father. Why the latter should so often allude to it was what surprised our Mr. Powell. This was by no means the first occasion, more like the 20th rather. And in his weak voice, with his monotonous intonation, leaning over the rail and looking at the water, the other continued this conversation, or rather his remarks of such a monstrous nature that Mr. Powell had no option but to accept them for gruesome jesting. "For instance," said Mr. Smith, "that mate, Franklin, I believe he would just as soon see us both overboard as not." "It's not so bad as that," laughed Mr. Powell, feeling uncomfortable, because his mind did not accommodate itself easily to exaggeration of statement. "He isn't a bad chap really," he added, very conscious of Mr. Franklin's offensive manner, of which instances were not far to seek. "He's such a fool as to be jealous. He has been with the captain for years. It's not for me to say, perhaps, but I think the captain has spoiled all that gang of old servants. They are like a lot of pet old dogs. Wouldn't let anybody come near him if they could help it. I've never seen anything like it, and the second mate, I believe, was like that too." "Well, he isn't here, luckily. There would have been one more enemy," said Mr. Smith. "There's enough of them without him, and you being here instead of him makes it much more pleasant for my daughter and myself. One feels there may be a friend in need. For really, for a woman all alone on board ship amongst a lot of unfriendly men—" "But Mrs. Powell is not alone," exclaimed Powell. "There's you, and there's the—" Mr. Smith interrupted him. "Nobody's immortal, and there are times when one feels ashamed to live. Such an evening as this, for instance." It was a lovely evening. The colours of a splendid sunset had died out, and the breath of a warm breeze seemed to have smoothed out the sea. Away to the south, the sheet lightning was like the flashing of an enormous lantern hidden under the horizon. In order to change the conversation, Mr. Powell said, "Anyway, no one can charge you with being a Jonah, Mr. Smith. We have had a magnificent quick passage so far. The captain ought to be pleased, and I suppose you are not sorry either." This diversion was not successful. Mr. Smith emitted a sort of bitter chuckle and said, "Jonah, that's the fellow that was thrown overboard by some sailors. It seems to me it's very easy at sea to get rid of a person one does not like. The sea does not give up its dead as the earth does." "You forget the whale, sir," said young Powell. Mr. Smith gave a start. "Eh? What whale?" "Oh, Jonah. I wasn't thinking of Jonah. I was thinking of this passage which seems so quick to you. But only think what it is to me. It isn't a life going about the sea like this. As, for instance, if one were to fall ill, there isn't a doctor to find out what's the matter with one. It's worrying. It makes me anxious at times." "Is Mrs. Anthony not feeling well?" asked Powell. But Mr. Smith's remark was not meant for Mrs. Anthony. She was well. He himself was well. It was the captain's health that did not seem quite satisfactory. Had Mr. Powell noticed his appearance? Mr. Powell didn't know enough of the captain to judge. He couldn't tell. But he observed thoughtfully that Mr. Franklin had been saying the same thing, and Franklin had known the captain for years. The mate was quite worried about it. This intelligence startled Mr. Smith considerably. "Does he think he is in danger of dying?" he exclaimed, with an animation quite extraordinary for him, which horrified Mr. Powell. "Heavens! Die? No! Don't you alarm yourself, sir. I've never heard a word about danger from Mr. Franklin." "Well, well," sighed Mr. Smith, and left the poop for the saloon rather abruptly. As a matter of fact, Mr. Franklin had been on deck for some considerable time. He had come to relieve young Powell, but seeing him engaged in talk with the enemy, with one of the enemies at least, had kept at a distance, which, the poop of the Ferndale being over 70 feet long, he had no difficulty in doing. Mr. Powell saw him at the head of the ladder, leaning on his elbow, melancholy and silent. "Oh, here you are, sir." "Here I am. Here I've been ever since 6 o'clock. Didn't want to interrupt the pleasant conversation. If you want to put in half of your watch below jawing with a dear friend, that's not my affair. Funny taste, though." "He isn't a bad chap," said the impartial Powell. The mate snorted angrily, tapping the deck with his foot. Then, "Isn't he? Well, give him my love when you come together again for another nice long yarn." "I say, Mr. Franklin, I wonder the captain don't take offence at your manners." "The captain? I wish to goodness he would start a row with me. Then I should know at least I am somebody on board. I'd welcome it, Mr. Powell. I'd rejoice. And damn me, I would talk back too, till I roused him. He's a shadow of himself. He walks about his ship like a ghost. He's fading away right before our eyes. But of course you don't see. You don't care a hang. Why should you?" Mr. Powell did not wait for more. He went down on the main deck. Without taking the mate's jeremiads seriously, he put them beside the words of Mr. Smith. He had grown already attached to Captain Anthony. There was something not only attractive but compelling in the man. Only it is very difficult for youth to believe in the menace of death. Not in the fact itself, but in its proximity to a breathing, moving, talking, superior human being showing no sign of disease. And Mr. Powell thought that this talk was all nonsense. But his curiosity was awakened. There was something, and at any time some circumstance might occur. No, he would never find out. There was nothing to find out, most likely. Mr. Powell went to his room, where he tried to read a book he had already read a good many times. Presently a bell rang for the officers' supper. End of Part 2, Chapter 5, Section 5. Part 2, Chapter 6, Section 1 of Chance by Joseph Conrad. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Read by Peter Dann. Chance, Part 2, Chapter 6. A moonless night, thick with stars above, very dark on the water. Section 1. In the mess room, Powell found Mr. Franklin hacking at a piece of cold salt beef with a table knife. The mate, fiery in the face and rolling his eyes over that task, explained that the carver belonging to the mess room could not be found. The steward, present also, complained savagely of the cook. The fellow got things into his galley and then lost them. Mr. Franklin tried to pacify him with mournful firmness. There, that will do. We who have been all these years together in the ship have other things to think about than quarrelling among ourselves." Mr. Powell thought with exasperation, here he goes again, for this utterance had nothing cryptic for him. The steward having withdrawn morosely, he was not surprised to hear the mate strike the usual note. That morning the mizzen topsail tie had carried away, probably a defective link, and something like 40 feet of chain and wire rope, mixed up with a few heavy iron blocks, had crashed down from aloft on the poop with a terrifying racket. "Did you notice the captain then, Mr. Powell? Did you notice?" Powell confessed frankly that he was too scared himself when all that lot of gear came down on deck to notice anything. "The gin block missed his head by an inch," went on the mate impressively. "I wasn't 3 feet from him, and what did he do? Did he shout or jump or even look aloft to see if the yard wasn't coming down too, about our ears in a dozen pieces? It's a marvel it didn't. No, he just stopped short. No wonder. He must have felt the wind of that iron gin block in his face, looked down at it there lying close to his feet, and went on again. I believe he didn't even blink. It isn't natural. The man is stupefied." He sighed ridiculously, and Mr. Powell had suppressed a grin when the mate added, as if he couldn't contain himself, "He'll be taking to drink next. Mark my words, that's the next thing." Mr. Powell was disgusted. "You are so fond of the captain, and yet you don't seem to care what you say about him. I haven't been with him for 7 years, but I know he isn't the sort of man that takes to drink. And then why the devil should he?" "Why the devil, you ask? Devil, eh? Well, no man is safe from the devil, and that's answer enough for you," wheezed Mr. Franklin, not unkindly. "There was a time, a long time ago, when I nearly took to drink myself. What do you say to that?" Mr. Powell expressed a polite incredulity. The thick, congested mate seemed on the point of bursting with despondency. "That was bad example, though. I was young and fell into dangerous company, made a fool of myself. Yes, as true as you see me sitting here. Drank to forget. Thought it a great dodge." Powell looked at the grotesque Franklin with awakened interest, and with that half-amused sympathy with which we receive unprovoked confidences from men with whom we have no sort of affinity. And at the same time he began to look upon him more seriously. Experience has its prestige, and the mate continued, "If it hadn't been for the old lady, I would have gone to the devil. I remembered her in time. Nothing like having an old lady to look after to steady a chap and make him face things. But as bad luck would have it, Captain Anthony has no mother living, not a blessed soul belonging to him, as far as I know. Oh, I fancy he said once something to me of a sister, but she's married. She don't need him. Yes, in the old days he used to talk to me as if we had been brothers," exaggerated the mate sentimentally. "Franklin," he would say, "this ship is my nearest relation, and she isn't likely to turn against me. And I suppose you're the man I've known the longest in the world." That's how he used to speak to me. Can I turn my back on him? He has turned his back on his ship, that's what it has come to. He has no one now but his old Franklin. But what's a fellow to do to put things back as they were and should be? Should be, I say." His starting eyes had a terrible fixity. Mr. Powell's irresistible thought, "He resembles a boiled lobster in distress," was followed by annoyance. "Good Lord," he said, "you don't mean to hint that Captain Anthony has fallen into bad company? What is it you want to save him from?" "I do mean it," affirmed the mate, and the very absurdity of the statement made it impressive, because it seemed so absolutely audacious. "Well, you have a cheek," said young Powell, feeling mentally helpless. "I have a notion the captain would half kill you if he were to know how you carry on." "And welcome," uttered the fervently devoted Franklin. "I am willing if he would only clear the ship afterwards of that. You are but a youngster, and you may go and tell him what you like. Let him knock the stuffing out of his old Franklin first, and think it over afterwards. Anything to pull him together. But of course you wouldn't. You're all right, only you don't know that things are sometimes different from what they look. There are friendships that are no friendships, and marriages that are no marriages." Likely to be right, wasn't it? Never a hint to me. I go off on leave, and when I come back, there it is, all over, settled. Not a word beforehand, no warning. If only... What do you think of it, Franklin, or anything of the sort? And that's a man who hardly ever did anything without asking my advice. Why, he couldn't take over a new coat from a tailor without... First thing, directly the fellow came on board with some new clothes, whether in London or in China, it would be, "Pass the word along there for Mr. Franklin. Mr. Franklin wanted in the cabin." In I would go. "Just look at my back, Franklin. Fits all right, doesn't it?" And I would say, "First rate, sir," or whatever was the truth of it. That or anything else. Always the truth of it. Always. And well he knew it, and that's why he dared not speak right out. Talking about workmen, alterations, cabins. Instead of a straightforward, "Wish me joy, Mr. Franklin." Yes, that was the way to let me know. God only knows what they are. Perhaps she isn't his daughter any more than she is. She doesn't resemble that old fellow, not a bit. Not a bit. It's very awful. You may well open your mouth, young man, but for goodness' sake, you who are mixed up with that lot, keep your eyes and ears open too, in case of, I don't know what, anything. One wonders what can happen here at sea. Nothing. Yet when a man is called a jailer behind his back... Mr. Franklin hid his face in his hands for a moment, and Powell shut his mouth, which indeed had been open. He slipped out of the mess room noiselessly. The mate's crazy, he thought. It was his firm conviction. Nevertheless, that evening he felt his inner tranquillity disturbed at last by the force and obstinacy of this craze. He couldn't dismiss it with the contempt it deserved. Had the word jailer really been pronounced? A strange word for the mate to even imagine he had heard. A senseless, unlikely word. But this word, being the only clear and definite statement in these grotesque and dismal ravings, was comparatively restful to his mind. Powell's mind rested on it still when he came up at 8 o'clock to take charge of the deck. It was a moonless night, thick with stars above, very dark on the water. A steady air from the west kept the sails asleep. Franklin mustered both watches in low tones as if for a funeral. Then, approaching Powell, "The course is east-south-east," said the chief mate distinctly. "East-south-east, sir." "Everything set, Mr. Powell." "All right, sir." The other lingered. His sentimental eyes gleamed silvery in the shadowy face. "A quiet night before us. I don't know that there are any special orders. A settled, quiet night. I dare say you won't see the captain. Once upon a time this was the watch he used to come up and start a chat with either of us then on deck. But now he sits in that infernal stern cabin and mopes. Jailer, eh?" Mr. Powell walked away from the mate, and when at some distance said "damn" quite heartily. It was a confounded nuisance. It had ceased to be funny. That hostile word jailer had given the situation an air of reality. Franklin's grotesque mortal envelope had disappeared from the poop to seek its needful repose, if only the worried soul would let it rest a while. Mr. Powell, half sorry for the thick little man, wondered whether it would let him. For himself, he recognized that the charm of a quiet watch on deck, when one may let one's thoughts roam in space and time, had been spoiled without remedy. What shocked him most was the implied aspersion of complicity on Mrs. Anthony. It angered him. In his own words to me, he felt very enthusiastic about Mrs. Anthony. Enthusiastic is good, especially as he couldn't exactly explain to me what he meant by it. But he felt enthusiastic, he says. That silly Franklin must have been dreaming, that was it. He had dreamt it all. Ass. Yet the injurious word stuck in Powell's mind with its associated ideas of prisoner, of escape. He became very uncomfortable. And just then, it might have been half an hour or more since he had relieved Franklin, just then Mr. Smith came up on the poop alone, like a gliding shadow, and leant over the rail by his side. Young Powell was affected disagreeably by his presence. He made a movement to go away, but the other began to talk, and Powell remained where he was, as if retained by a mysterious compulsion. The conversation, started by Mr. Smith, had nothing peculiar. He began to talk of mail-boats in general, and in the end seemed anxious to discover what were the services from Port Elizabeth to London. Mr. Powell did not know for certain, but imagined that there must be communication with England at least twice a month. "Are you thinking of leaving us, sir? Of going home by steam? Perhaps with Mrs. Anthony?" he asked anxiously. No, how can I?" Mr. Smith got quite agitated for him, which did not amount to much. He was just asking for the sake of something to talk about. No idea at all of going home. One could not always do what one wanted, and that's why there were moments when one felt ashamed to live. This did not mean that one did not want to live. Oh, no. He spoke with careless slowness, pausing frequently, and in such a low voice that Powell had to strain his hearing to catch the phrases, dropped overboard, as it were. And indeed they seemed not worth the effort. It was like the aimless talk of a man pursuing a secret train of thought, far removed from the idle words we so often utter only to keep in touch with our fellow beings. An hour passed. It seemed as though Mr. Smith could not make up his mind to go below. He repeated himself. Again he spoke of lives which one was ashamed of. It was necessary to put up with such lives as long as there was no way out, no possible issue. He even alluded once more to mail-boat services on the east coast of Africa, and young Powell had to tell him once more that he knew nothing about them. "Every fortnight, I thought you said," insisted Mr. Smith. He stirred, seemed to detach himself from the rail with difficulty. His long, slender figure straightened into stiffness, as if hostile to the enveloping soft peace of air and sea and sky, emitted into the night a weak murmur which Mr. Powell fancied was the word abominable, repeated 3 times, but which passed into the faintly louder declaration, "The moment has come to go to bed," followed by a just audible sigh. "I sleep very well," added Mr. Smith in his restrained tone, "but it is the moment one opens one's eyes that is horrible at sea. These days, oh, these days! I wonder how anybody can—" "I like the life," observed Mr. Powell. "Oh, you have only yourself to think of. You have made your bed. Well, it's very pleasant to feel that you are friendly to us. My daughter has taken quite a liking to you, Mr. Powell." He murmured "good night" and glided away rigidly. Young Powell asked himself with some distaste what was the meaning of these utterances. His mind had been worried at last into that questioning attitude by no other person than the grotesque Franklin. Suspicion was not natural to him, and he took good care to carefully separate in his thoughts Mrs. Anthony from this man of enigmatic words, her father. Presently he observed that the sheen of the 2-deck deadlights on Mr. Smith's room had gone out. The old gentleman had been surprisingly quick in getting into bed. Shortly afterwards the lamp in the foremost skylight of the saloon was turned out, and this was the sign that the steward had taken in the tray and had retired for the night. Young Powell had settled down to the regular officer of the watch tramp in the dense shadow of the world decorated with stars high above his head, and on earth only a few gleams of light about the ship. The lamp in the after skylight was kept burning through the night. There were also the deadlights of the stern cabins glimmering dully in the deck far aft, catching his eye when he turned to walk that way. The brasses of the wheel glittered too, with the dimly lit figure of the man detached as if phosphorescent against the black and spangled background of the horizon. Young Powell, in the silence of the ship, reinforced by the great silent stillness of the world, said to himself that there was something mysterious in such beings as the absurd Franklin, and even in such beings as himself. It was a strange and almost improper thought to occur to the officer of the watch of a ship on the high seas on no matter how quiet a night. Why on earth was he bothering his head? Why couldn't he dismiss all these people from his mind? It was as if the mate had infected him with his own diseased devotion. He would not have believed it possible that he should be so foolish. But he was, clearly. He was foolish in a way totally unforeseen by himself. Pushing this self-analysis further, he reflected that the springs of his conduct were just as obscure. "I may be catching myself any time doing things of which I have no conception," he thought. And as he was passing near the mizzen-mast, he perceived a coil of rope left lying on the deck by the oversight of the sweepers. By an impulse which had nothing mysterious in it, he stooped as he went by with the intention of picking it up and hanging it on its proper pin. This movement brought his head down to the level of the glazed end of the after skylight, the lighted skylight of the most private part of the saloon, consecrated to the exclusiveness of Captain Anthony's married life. The part, let me remind you, cut off from the rest of that forbidden space by a pair of heavy curtains. I mention these curtains because at this point Mr. Powell himself recalled the existence of that unusual arrangement to my mind. He recalled them with simple-minded compunction at that distance of time. He said, "You understand that directly I stooped to pick up that coil of running gear, the spanker-foot out-haul it was, I perceived that I could see right into that part of the saloon the curtains were meant to make particularly private. Do you understand me?" he insisted. I told him that I understood, and he proceeded to call my attention to the wonderful linking up of small facts, with something of awe left yet, after all these years, at the precise workmanship of chance, fate, providence, call it what you will. "For observe, Marlow," he said, making at me very round eyes, which contrasted funnily with the austere touch of grey on his temples, "observe, my dear fellow, that everything depended on the men who cleared up the poop in the evening, leaving that coil of rope on the deck and on the topsail tie, carrying away in a most incomprehensible and surprising manner earlier in the day, and the end of the chain whipping round the coaming and shivering to bits the coloured glass pane at the end of the skylight. It had the arms of the city of Liverpool on it. I don't know why, unless because the Ferndale was registered in Liverpool. It was very thick plate glass. Anyhow, the upper part got smashed, and directly we had attended to things aloft, Mr. Franklin had set the carpenter to patch up the damage with some pieces of plain glass. I don't know where they got them. I think the people who fitted up the new bookcase in the captain's room had left some spare panes. Chips was there the whole afternoon on his knees, messing with putty and red lead. It wasn't a neat job when it was done, not by any means, but it would serve to keep the weather out and let the light in. Clear glass. And of course I was not thinking of it. I just stooped to pick up that rope and found my head within 3 inches of that clear glass, and, dash it all, I found myself out. Not half an hour before I was saying to myself that it was impossible to tell what was in people's heads or at the back of their talk, or what they were likely to be up to. And here I found myself up to as low a trick as you can well think of. For after I had stooped, there I remained prying, spying, anywhere looking where I had no business to look. Not consciously at first, maybe. He who has eyes, you know, nothing can stop him from seeing things as long as there are things to see in front of him. What I saw at first was the end of the table and the tray clamped onto it, a patent tray for sea use, fitted with holders for a couple of decanters, water jugs and glasses. The glitter of these things caught my eye first, but what I saw next was the captain down there, alone as far as I could see, and I could see pretty well the whole of that part up to the cottage piano, dark against the satin-wood panelling of the bulkhead. And I remained looking. I did. And I don't know that I was ashamed of myself either, then. It was the fault of that Franklin, always talking of the man, making free with him to that extent that really he seemed to have become our property, his and mine, in a way. It's funny, but one had that feeling about Captain Anthony. To watch him was not so much worse than listening to Franklin talking him over. Well, there's no use making excuses for what's inexcusable. I watched, but I dare say you know that there could have been nothing inimical in this low behaviour of mine. On the contrary, I'll tell you now what he was doing. He was helping himself out of a decanter. I saw every movement, and I said to myself mockingly, as though jeering at Franklin in my thoughts, "Hello, here's the captain taking to drink at last." He poured a little brandy or whatever it was into a long glass, filled it with water, drank about 1/4 of it, and stood the glass back into the holder. Every sign of a bad drinking bout, I was saying to myself, feeling quite amused at the notions of that Franklin. He seemed to me an enormous ass with his jealousy and his fears. At that rate, a month would not have been enough for anybody to get drunk. The captain sat down in one of the swivel armchairs fixed round the table. I had him right under me, and as he turned the chair slightly I was looking, I may say, down his back. He took another little sip and then reached for a book which was lying on the table. I had not noticed it before. Altogether the proceedings of a desperate drunkard, weren't they? He opened the book and held it before his face. If this was the way he took to drink, then I needn't worry. He was in no danger from that, and as to any other, I assure you no human being could have looked safer than he did down there. I felt the greatest contempt for Franklin just then, while I looked at Captain Anthony sitting there with a glass of weak brandy and water at his elbow and reading in the cabin of his ship on a quiet night, the quietest, perhaps the finest, of a prosperous voyage. And if you wonder why I didn't leave off my ugly spying, I will tell you how it was. Captain Anthony was a great reader just about that time, and I, too, have a great liking for books. To this day I can't come near a book but I must know what it is about. It was a thickish volume he had there, small close print, double columns. I can see it now. What I wanted to make out was the title at the top of the page. I have very good eyes, but he wasn't holding it conveniently. I mean, for me, up there. Well, it was a history of some kind, that much I read, and then suddenly he bangs the book face down on the table, jumps up as if something had bitten him, and walks away aft. Funny thing, shame is. I had been behaving badly and aware of it in a way, but I didn't feel really ashamed till the fright of being found out in my honourable occupation drove me from it. I slunk away from the forward end of the poop and lounged about there, my face and ears burning, and glad it was a dark night, expecting every moment to hear the captain's footsteps behind me, for I made sure he was coming on deck. Presently I thought I had rather meet him face to face, and I walked slowly aft, prepared to see him emerge from the companion before I got that far. I even thought of his having detected me by some means, but it was impossible unless he had eyes in the top of his head. I had never had a view of his face down there. It was impossible. I was safe, and I felt very mean, yet, explain it as you may, I seemed not to care. And the captain not appearing on deck, I had the impulse to go on being mean. I wanted another peep. I really don't know what was the beastly influence, except that Mr. Franklin's talk was enough to demoralize any man by raising a sort of unhealthy curiosity, which did away, in my case, with all the restraints of common decency. I did not mean to run the risk of being caught squatting in a suspicious attitude by the captain. There was also the helmsman to consider. So what I did, I'm surprised at my low cunning, was to sit down naturally on the skylight seat, and then, by bending forward, I found that, as I expected, I could look down through the upper part of the end pane. The worst that could happen to me then, if I remained too long in that position, was to be suspected by the seaman aft at the wheel of having gone to sleep there. For the rest, my ears would give me sufficient warning of any movements in the companion. But in that way my angle of view was changed. The field, too, was smaller. The end of the table, the tray, and the swivel chair I had right under my eyes. The captain had not come back yet. The piano I could not see now, but on the other hand I had a very oblique downward view of the curtains drawn across the cabin and cutting off the forward part of it just about the level of the skylight end, and only an inch or so from the end of the table. They were heavy stuff, travelling on a thick brass rod with some contrivance to keep the rings from sliding to and fro when the ship rolled. But just then the ship was as still almost as a model shut up in a glass case, while the curtains, joined closely and perhaps on purpose, made a little too long, moved no more than a solid wall. End of Part 2, Chapter 6, Section 1. Part 2, Chapter 6, Section 2 of Chance by Joseph Conrad. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Read by Peter Dann. Chance, Part 2, Chapter 6, Section 2. Marlow got up to get another cigar. The night was getting on to what I may call its deepest hour, the hour most favourable to evil purposes of men's hate, despair, or greed, to whatever can whisper into their ears the unlawful counsels of protest against things that are, the hour of ill-omened silence and chill and stagnation, the hour when the criminal plies his trade and the victim of sleeplessness reaches the lower depths of dreadful discouragement, the hour before the first sight of dawn. I know it, because while Marlow was crossing the room I looked at the clock on the mantelpiece. He, however, never looked that way, though it is possible that he too was aware of the passage of time. He sat down heavily. "Our friend Powell," he began again, "was very anxious that I should understand the topography of that cabin. I was interested more by its moral atmosphere, that tension of falsehood, of desperate acting, which tainted the pure sea atmosphere into which the magnanimous Anthony had carried off his conquest and, well, his self-conquest too, trying to act at the same time like a beast of prey, a pure spirit, and the most generous of men. Too big an order, clearly, because he was nothing of a monster, but just a common mortal, a little more self-willed and self-confident than most, maybe, both in his roughness and in his delicacy. As to the delicacy of Mr. Powell's proceedings, I'll say nothing. He found a sort of depraved excitement in watching an unconscious man, and such an attractive and mysterious man as Captain Anthony at that. He wanted another peep at him. He surmised that the captain must come back soon because of the glass 2/3 full, and also of the book put down so brusquely. God knows what sudden pang had made Anthony jump up so. I am convinced he used reading as an opiate against the pain of his magnanimity, which, like all abnormal growths, was gnawing at his healthy substance with cruel persistence. Perhaps he had rushed into his cabin simply to groan freely in absolute and delicate secrecy. At any rate, he tarried there, and young Powell would have grown weary and compunctious at last if it had not become manifest to him that he had not been alone in the highly incorrect occupation of watching the movements of Captain Anthony. Powell explained to me that no sound did or perhaps could reach him from the saloon. The first sign, and we must remember that he was using his eyes for all they were worth, was an unaccountable movement of the curtain. It was wavy and very slight, just perceptible, in fact, to the sharpened faculties of a secret watcher, for it can't be denied that our wits are much more alert when engaged in wrong-doing, in which one mustn't be found out, than in a righteous occupation. He became suspicious, with no one and nothing definite in his mind. He was suspicious of the curtain itself, and observed it. It looked very innocent. Then, just as he was ready to put it down to a trick of imagination, he saw trembling movements where the two curtains joined. Yes, somebody else besides himself had been watching Captain Anthony. He owns artlessly that this roused his indignation. It was really too much of a good thing. In this state of intense antagonism he was startled to observe tips of fingers fumbling with the dark stuff. Then they grasped the edge of the further curtain and hung on there, just fingers and knuckles and nothing else. It made an abominable sight. He was looking at it with unaccountable repulsion when a hand came into view, a short, puffy, old, freckled hand, projecting into the lamplight, followed by a white wrist, an arm in a grey coat sleeve up to the elbow, beyond the elbow, extended tremblingly towards the tray. Its appearance was weird and nauseous, fantastic and silly. But instead of grabbing the bottle, as Powell expected, this hand, tremulous with senile eagerness, swerved to the glass, rested on its edge for a moment, or so it looked from above, and went back with a jerk. The gripping fingers of the other hand vanished at the same time, and young Powell, staring at the motionless curtains, could indulge for a moment the notion that he had been dreaming. But that notion did not last long. Powell, after repressing his first impulse to spring for the companion and hammer at the captain's door, took steps to have himself relieved by the boatswain. He was in a state of distraction as to his feelings, and yet lucid as to his mind. He remained on the skylight so as to keep his eye on the tray. Still the captain did not appear in the saloon. If he had, said Mr. Powell, I knew what to do. I would have put my elbow through the pane instantly. Crash! I asked him why. It was the quickest dodge for getting him away from that tray, he explained. My throat was so dry that I didn't know if I could shout loud enough, and this was not a case for shouting either. The boatswain, sleepy and disgusted, arriving on the poop, found the second officer doubled up over the end of the skylight in a pose which might have been that of severe pain. And his voice was so changed that the man, though naturally vexed at being turned out, made no comment on the plea of sudden indisposition which young Powell put forward. The rapidity with which the sick man got off the poop must have astonished the boatswain. But Powell, at the moment he opened the door leading into the saloon from the quarter-deck, had managed to control his agitation. He entered swiftly but without noise, and found himself in the dark part of the saloon, the strong sheen of the lamp on the other side of the curtains visible only above the rod on which they ran. The door of Mr. Smith's cabin was in that dark part. He passed by it, assuring himself by a quick side glance that it was imperfectly closed. "Yes," he said to me, "the old man must have been watching through the crack. Of that I am certain. But it was not for me that he was watching and listening. Horrible! Surely he must have been startled to hear and see somebody he did not expect. He could not possibly guess why I was coming in, but I suppose he must have been concerned." Concerned, indeed. He must have been thunderstruck, appalled. Powell's only distinct aim was to remove the suspected tumbler. He had no other plan, no other intention, no other thought. Do away with it in some manner, snatch it up and run out with it. You know that complete mastery of one fixed idea, not a reasonable but an emotional mastery, a sort of concentrated exaltation. Under its empire men rush blindly through fire and water and opposing violence, and nothing can stop them, unless sometimes a grain of sand. For his blind purpose, and clearly the thought of Mrs. Anthony was at the bottom of it, Mr. Powell had plenty of time. What checked him at the crucial moment was the familiar, harmless aspect of common things, the steady light, the open book on the table, the solitude, the peace, the home-like effect of the place. He held the glass in his hand. All he had to do was to vanish back beyond the curtains, flee with it noiselessly into the night on deck, fling it unseen overboard, a minute or less. And then all that would have happened would have been the wonder at the utter disappearance of a glass tumbler, a ridiculous riddle in pantry affairs beyond the wit of anyone on board to solve. The grain of sand against which Powell stumbled in his headlong career was a moment of incredulity as to the truth of his own conviction, because it had failed to affect the safe aspect of familiar things. He doubted his eyes, too. He must have dreamt it all. "I'm dreaming now," he said to himself. And very likely for a few seconds he must have looked like a man in a trance, or profoundly asleep on his feet, and with a glass of brandy and water in his hand. What woke him up, and at the same time fixed his feet immovably to the spot, was a voice asking him what he was doing there, in tones of thunder, or so it sounded to his ears. Anthony, opening the door of his stern cabin, had naturally exclaimed. What else could you expect? And the exclamation must have been fairly loud if you consider the nature of the sight which met his eye. There before him stood his second officer, a seemingly decent, well-bred young man who, being on duty, had left the deck and had sneaked into the saloon, apparently for the inexpressibly mean purpose of drinking up what was left of his captain's brandy and water. There he was, caught absolutely with a glass in his hand. But the very monstrosity of appearances silenced Anthony after the first exclamation, and young Powell felt himself pierced through and through by the overshadowed glance of his captain. Anthony advanced quietly. The first impulse of Mr. Powell, when discovered, had been to dash the glass on the deck. He was in a sort of panic, but deep down within him his wits were working, and the idea that if he did that he could prove nothing, and that the story he had to tell was completely incredible, restrained him. The captain came forward slowly. With his eyes now close to his, Powell, spellbound, numb all over, managed to lift one finger to the deck above mumbling the explanatory words, "Boatswain, on the poop." The captain moved his head slightly, as much as to say, "That's all right," and this was all. Powell had no voice, no strength. The air was unbreathable, thick, sticky, odious, like hot jelly in which all movements became difficult. He raised the glass a little with immense difficulty and moved his trammelled lips sufficiently to form the words, "Doctored." Anthony glanced at it for an instant, only for an instant, and again fastened his eyes on the face of his second mate. Powell added a fervent, "I believe," and put the glass down on the tray. The captain's glance followed the movement and returned sternly to his face. The young man pointed a finger once more upwards and squeezed out of his iron-bound throat 6 consecutive words of further explanation. "Through the skylight, the white pane, The captain raised his eyebrows very much at this, while young Powell, ashamed but desperate, nodded insistently several times. He meant to say that, yes, he had done that thing. He had been spying. The captain's gaze became thoughtful, and now the confession was over, the iron-bound feeling of Powell's throat passed away, giving place to a general anxiety which, from his breast, seemed to extend to all the limbs and organs of his body. His legs trembled a little, his vision was confused, his mind became blankly expectant. But he was alert enough. At a movement of Anthony, he screamed in a strangled whisper, "Don't, sir, don't touch it!" The captain pushed aside Powell's extended arm, took up the glass and raised it slowly against the lamplight. The liquid, of a very pale amber colour, was clear, and by a glance the captain seemed to call Powell's attention to the fact. Powell tried to pronounce the word dissolved, but he only thought of it with great energy, which, however, failed to move his lips. Only when Anthony had put down the glass and turned to him, he recovered such a complete command of his voice that he could keep it down to a hurried, forcible whisper, a whisper that shook him. "Doctored, I swear it, I have seen. Doctored, I have seen." Not a feature of the captain's face moved. His was a calm to take one's breath away. It did so to young Powell. Then, for the first time, Anthony made himself heard to the point. "You did? Who was it?" And Powell gasped freely at last. "A hand," he whispered fearfully. "A hand and the arm. Only the arm. Like that." He advanced his own, slow, stealthy, tremulous, in faithful reproduction, the tips of 2 fingers and the thumb pressed together and hovering above the glass for an instant, then the swift jerk back after the deed. "Like that," he repeated, growing excited. "From behind this." He grasped the curtain and, glaring at the silent Anthony, flung it back, disclosing the forepart of the saloon. There was no one to be seen. Powell had not expected to see anybody. "But," he said to me, "I knew very well there was an ear listening and an eye glued to the crack of a cabin door." Awful thought. And that door was in that part of the saloon remaining in the shadow of the other half of the curtain. I pointed at it, and I suppose that old man inside saw me pointing. The captain had a wonderful self-command. You couldn't have guessed anything from his face. Well, it was perhaps more thoughtful than usual, and indeed this was something to think about. But I couldn't think steadily. My brain would give a sort of jerk and then go dead again. I had lost all notion of time, and I might have been looking at the captain for days and months for all I knew, before I heard him whisper to me fiercely, "Not a word." This jerked me out of that trance I was in, and I said, No, I didn't mean even you." I wanted to explain my conduct, my intentions, but I read in his eyes that he understood me, and I was only too glad to leave off. And there we were, looking at each other, dumb, brought up short by the question, what next? I thought Captain Anthony was a man of iron till I saw him suddenly fling his head to the right and to the left fiercely, like a wild animal at bay, not knowing which way to break out. End of Part 2, Chapter 6, Section 2. Part 2, Chapter 6, Section 3 of Chance by Joseph Conrad. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Read by Peter Dann. Chance, Part 2, Chapter 6, Section 3. "Truly," commented Marlow, "brought to bay was not a bad comparison, a better one than Mr. Powell was aware of." At that moment the appearance of Flora could not but bring the tension to the breaking point. She came out in all innocence, but not without vague dread. Anthony's exclamation on first seeing Powell had reached her in her cabin, where, it seems, she was brushing her hair. She had heard the very words, "What are you doing here?" And the unwonted loudness of the voice, his voice, breaking the habitual stillness of that hour, would have startled a person having much less reason to be constantly apprehensive than the captive of Anthony's masterful generosity. She had no means to guess to whom the question was addressed, and it echoed in her heart, as Anthony's voice always did. Followed complete silence. She waited, anxious, expectant, till she could stand the strain no longer, and with the weary mental appeal of the overburdened, "My God, what is it now?" she opened the door of her room and looked into the saloon. Her first glance fell on Powell. For a moment, seeing only the second officer with Anthony, she felt relieved and made as if to draw back, but her sharpened perception detected something suspicious in their attitudes, and she came forward slowly. "I was the first to see Mrs. Anthony," related Powell, "because I was facing aft. The captain, noticing my eyes, looked quickly over his shoulder and at once put his finger to his lips to caution me. As if I were likely to let out anything before her. Mrs. Anthony had on a dressing-gown of some grey stuff with red facings and a thick red cord round her waist. Her hair was down. She looked a child, a pale-faced child with big blue eyes and a red mouth a little open, showing a glimmer of white teeth. The light fell strongly on her as she came up to the end of the table. A strange child, though. She hardly affected one like a child, I remember. "Do you know," exclaimed Mr. Powell, who clearly must have been, like many seamen, an industrious reader, "do you know what she looked like to me, with those big eyes and something appealing in her whole expression? She looked like a forsaken elf." Captain Anthony had moved forward to keep her away from my end of the table where the tray was. I had never seen them so near to each other before, and it made a great contrast. It was wonderful, for, with his beard cut to a point, his swarthy, sunburnt complexion, thin nose, and his lean head, there was something African, something Moorish in Captain Anthony. His neck was bare. He had taken off his coat and collar, and had drawn on his sleeping jacket in the time he had been absent from the saloon. I seemed to see him now, Mrs. Anthony too. She looked from him to me. I suppose I looked guilty or frightened, and from me to him, trying to guess what there was between us two. Then she burst out with a "What has happened?" which seemed addressed to me. I mumbled, "Nothing, nothing, ma'am," which she very likely did not hear. You must not think that all this had lasted a long time. She had taken fright at our behaviour, and turned to the captain pitifully. "What is it you are concealing from me?" A straight question, eh? I don't know what answer the captain would have made. Before he could even raise his eyes to her, she cried out, "Ah, here's Papa," in a sharp tone of relief, but directly afterwards she looked to me as if she were holding her breath with apprehension. I was so interested in her that, how shall I say it, her exclamation made no connection in my mind at first. I also noticed that she had sidled up a little nearer to Captain Anthony before it occurred to me to turn my head. I can tell you that my neck stiffened in the twisted position from the shock of actually seeing that old man. He had dared. I suppose you think I ought to have looked upon him as mad, but I couldn't. It would have been certainly easier, but I could not. You should have seen him. First of all, he was completely dressed, with his very cap still on his head, just as when he left me on deck 2 hours before, saying in his soft voice, "The moment has come to go to bed," while he meant to go down and do that thing and hide in his dark cabin and watch the stuff do its work. A cold shudder ran down my back. He had his hands in the pockets of his jacket. His arms were pressed close to his thin, upright body, and he shuffled across the cabin with his short steps. There was a red patch on each of his old soft cheeks, as if somebody had been pinching them. He drooped his head a little, and looked with a sort of underhand expectation at the captain and Mrs. Anthony standing close together at the other end of the saloon. The calculating, horrible impudence of it! His daughter was there, and I am certain he had seen the captain putting his finger on his lips to warn me. And then he had coolly come out. He passed my imagination, I assure you. After that one shiver, his presence killed every faculty in me, wonder, horror, indignation. I felt nothing in particular, just as if he was still the old gentleman who used to talk to me familiarly every day on deck. Would you believe it? Mr. Powell challenged my powers of wonder at this internal phenomenon, went on Marlow after a slight pause. But even if they had not been fully engaged, together with all my powers of attention in following the facts of the case, I would not have been astonished by his statements about himself. Taking into consideration his youth, they were by no means incredible. or at any rate they were the least incredible part of the whole. They were also the least interesting part. The interest was elsewhere, and there, of course, all he could do was to look at the surface. The inwardness of what was passing before his eyes was hidden from him, who had looked on, more impenetrably than from me, who at a distance of years was listening to his words. What presently happened at this crisis in Flora de Barrall's fate was beyond his power of comment, seemed, in a sense, natural. And his own presence on the scene was so strangely motived that it was left to me to marvel alone at this young man, a completely chance comer, having brought it about on that night. Each situation created either by folly or wisdom has its psychological moment. The behaviour of young Powell, with its mixture of boyish impulses combined with instinctive prudence, had not created it, I can't say that, but had discovered it to the very people involved. What would have happened if he had made a noise about his discovery? But he didn't. His head was full of Mrs. Anthony, and he behaved with a discretion beyond his years. Some nice children often do, and surely it is not from reflection. They have their own inspirations. Young Powell's inspiration consisted in being enthusiastic about Mrs. Anthony. Enthusiastic is really good, and he was amongst them like a child, sensitive, impressionable, plastic, but unable to find for himself any sort of comment. I don't know how much mine may be worth, but I believe that just then the tension of the false situation was at its highest. Of all the forms offered to us by life, it is the one demanding a couple to realize it fully which is the most imperative. Pairing off is the fate of mankind, and if two beings thrown together, mutually attracted, resist the necessity, fail in understanding, and voluntarily stop short of the embrace in the noblest meaning of the word, then they are committing a sin against life, the call of which is simple, perhaps sacred. And the punishment of it is an invasion of complexity, a tormenting, forcibly tortuous involution of feelings, the deepest form of suffering from which indeed something significant may come at last, which may be criminal or heroic, may be madness or wisdom, or even a straight if despairing decision. Powell, on taking his eyes off the old gentleman, noticed Captain Anthony, swarthy as an African, by the side of Flora, whiter than the lilies, take his handkerchief out and wipe off his forehead the sweat of anguish, like a man who is overcome. "And no wonder," commented Mr. Powell here. Then the captain said, "Hadn't you better go back to your room?" This was to Mrs. Anthony. He tried to smile at her. "Why do you look startled? This night is like any other night." Which, Powell again commented to me earnestly, was a lie. No wonder he sweated. You see from this the value of Powell's comments. Mrs. Anthony then said, "Why are you sending me away?" "Why, that you should go to sleep, that you should rest." And Captain Anthony frowned. Then sharply, "You stay here, Mr. Powell. I shall want you presently." As a matter of fact, Powell had not moved. Flora did not mind his presence. He himself had the feeling of being of no account to those three people. He was looking at Mrs. Anthony as unabashed as the proverbial cat looking at a king. Mrs. Anthony glanced at him. She did not move, gripped by an inexplicable premonition. She had arrived at the very limit of her endurance, as the object of Anthony's magnanimity. She was the prey of an intuitive dread of she did not know what mysterious influence. She felt herself being pushed back into that solitude, that moral loneliness which had made all her life intolerable. And then, in that close communion established again with Anthony, she felt, as on that night in the garden, the force of his personal fascination. The passive quietness with which she looked at him gave her the appearance of a person bewitched, or, say, mesmerically put to sleep, beyond any notion of her surroundings. After telling Mr. Powell not to go away, the captain remained silent. Suddenly Mrs. Anthony pushed back her loose hair with a decisive gesture of her arms and moved still nearer to him. "Here's Papa up yet," she said, but she did not look towards Mr. Smith. "Why is it? And you? I can't go on like this, Roderick. Between you two. Don't." Anthony interrupted her as if something had untied his tongue. Oh yes, here's your father, and why not? Perhaps it is just as well you came out. Between us two, is that it? I won't pretend I don't understand. I am not blind, but I can't fight any longer for what I haven't got. I don't know what you imagine has happened. Something has, though. Only you needn't be afraid. No shadow can touch you, because I give up. I can't say we had much talk about it, your father and I, but the long and the short of it is that I must learn to live without you, which I have told you was impossible. I was speaking the truth, but I have done fighting or waiting or hoping. Yes, you shall go. At this point Mr. Powell, who, he confessed to me, was listening with uncomprehending awe, heard behind his back a triumphant chuckling sound. It gave him the shudders, he said, to mention it now, but at the time, except for another chill down the spine, it had not the power to destroy his absorption in the scene before his eyes, and before his ears too, because just then Captain Anthony raised his voice grimly. Perhaps he too had heard the chuckle of the old man. "Your father has found an argument which makes me pause, if it does not convince me. No, I can't answer it. I don't want to answer it. I simply surrender. He shall have his way with you and with me. Only," he added in a gloomy, lowered tone which struck Mr. Power as if a pedal had been put down, "only it shall take a little time. I have never lied to you, never. I renounce not only my chance but my life. In a few days, directly we get into port, the very moment we do, I, who have said I could never let you go, I shall let you go." To the innocent beholder, Anthony seemed at this point to become physically exhausted. My view is that the utter falseness of his, I may say, aspirations, the vanity of grasping the empty air, had come to him with an overwhelming force, leaving him disarmed before the other's mad and sinister sincerity. As he had said himself, he could not fight for what he did not possess. He could not face such a thing as this for the sake of his mere magnanimity. The normal alone can overcome the abnormal. He could not even reproach that man over there. "I own myself beaten," he said in a firmer tone. "You are free. I let you off, since I must." Powell, the onlooker, affirms that at these incomprehensible words Mrs. Anthony stiffened into the very image of astonishment, with a frightened stare and frozen lips. But next minute a cry came out from her heart, not very loud, but of a quality which made not only Captain Anthony — he was not looking at her — not only him, but also the more distant and equally unprepared young man catch their breath. "But I don't want to be let off," she cried. She was so still that one asked oneself whether the cry had come from her. The restless shuffle behind Powell's back stopped short. The intermittent, shadowy chuckling ceased too. Young Powell, glancing round, saw Mr. Smith raise his head with his faded eyes very still, puckered at the corners, like a man perceiving something coming at him from a great distance. And Mrs. Anthony's voice reached Powell's ears, entreating and indignant. "You can't cast me off like this, Roderick. I won't go away from you. I won't." Powell turned about and discovered then that what Mr. Smith was puckering his eyes at was the sight of his daughter clinging round Captain Anthony's neck, a sight not in itself improper, but which had the power to move young Powell with a bashfully profound emotion. It was different from his emotion while spying at the revelations of the skylight, but in this case too he felt the discomfort, if not the guilt, of an unseen beholder. Experience was being piled up on his young shoulders. Mrs. Anthony's hair hung back in a dark mass like the hair of a drowned woman. She looked as if she would let go and sink to the floor if the captain were to withhold his sustaining arm. But the captain obviously had no such intention. Standing firm and still, he gazed with sombre eyes at Mr. Smith. For a time the low convulsive sobbing of Mr. Smith's daughter was the only sound to trouble the silence. The strength of Anthony's clasp, pressing Flora to his breast, could not be doubted even at that distance, and suddenly, awakening to his opportunity, he began to partly support her, partly carry her in the direction of her cabin. His head was bent over her solicitously. Then, recollecting himself, with a glance full of unwonted fire, his voice ringing in a note unknown to Mr. Powell, he cried to him, "Don't you go on deck yet. I want you to stay here till I come back. There are some instructions I want to give you." And before the young man could answer, Anthony had disappeared in the stern cabin, burdened and exulting. "Instructions," commented Mr. Powell. That was all right. Very likely, but they would be such instructions as, I thought to myself, no ship's officer perhaps had ever been given before. It made me feel a little sick to think what they would be dealing with, probably. But there, everything that happens on board ship on the high seas has got to be dealt with somehow. There are no special people to fly to for assistance. And there I was with that old man left in my charge. When he noticed me looking at him, he started to shuffle again athwart the saloon. He kept his hands rammed in his pockets. He was as stiff-backed as ever, only his head hung down. After a bit, he says, in his gentle, soft tone, "Did you see it?" There were in Powell's head no special words to fit the horror of his feelings. So he said, he had to say something, "Good God, what were you thinking of, Mr. Smith, to try to—" And then he left off. He dared not utter the awful word poison. Mr. Smith stopped his prowl. "Think? What do you know of thinking? I don't think. There is something in my head that thinks. The thoughts of men, it's like being drunk with liquor, or... You can't stop them. A man who thinks will think anything. No, but have you seen it? Have you?" "I tell you I have. I am certain," said Powell forcibly. "I was looking at you all the time. You have done something to the drink in that glass." Then Powell lost his breath somehow. Mr. Smith looked at him curiously, with mistrust. "My good young man, I don't know what you are talking about. I ask you, have you seen? Who would have believed it, with her arms round his neck, when... Oh, ha, ha! Did you see? Didn't you? It wasn't a delusion, was it? Her arms round... But I have never wholly trusted her." "Then I flew out at him," said Mr. Powell. "I told him he was jolly lucky to have fallen upon Captain Anthony. A man in a million." He started again, shuffling to and fro. "You too," he said mournfully, keeping his eyes down. Wonderful man. But have you a notion who I am? Listen. I have been the great Mr. de Barrall. So they printed it in the papers while they were getting up a conspiracy. And I have been doing time, and now I am brought low." His voice died down to a mere breath. Brought low. He took his hands out of his pocket, dragged the cap down on his head, and stuck them back into his pockets, exactly as if preparing himself to go out into a great wind. But not so low as to put up with this disgrace, to see her fast in this fellow's clutches without doing something. She wouldn't listen to me. Frightened, silly, I had to think of some way to get her out of this. Did you think she cared for him? No. Would anybody have thought so? No. She pretended it was for my sake. She couldn't understand that if I hadn't been an old man, I would have flown at his throat months ago. As it was, I was tempted every time he looked at her. My girl, oh, any man but this. And all the time the wicked little fool was lying to me. It was their plot, their conspiracy. These conspiracies are the devil. She has been leading me on, till she has fairly put my head under the heel of that jailer, of that scoundrel, of her husband. Treachery, bringing me low, lower than herself, in the dirt. That's what it means, doesn't it? Under his heel. He paused in his restless shuffle, and again, seizing his cap with both hands, dragged it furiously right down on his ears. Powell had lost himself in listening to these broken ravings, in looking at that old feverish face, when suddenly, quick as lightning, Mr. Smith spun round, snatched up the captain's glass, and with a stifled, hurried exclamation, "Here's luck!" tossed the liquor down his throat. I know now the meaning of the word consternation, went on Mr. Powell. That was exactly my state of mind. I thought to myself directly, there's nothing in that drink. I have been dreaming. I have made the awfullest mistake. Mr. Smith put the glass down. He stood before Powell, unharmed, quieted down, in a listening attitude, his head inclined on one side, chewing his thin lips. Suddenly he blinked queerly, grabbed Powell's shoulder, and collapsed, subsiding all at once as though he had gone soft all over, as a piece of silk stuff collapses. Powell seized his arm instinctively and checked his fall, but as soon as Mr. Smith was fairly on the floor, he jerked himself free and backed away. Almost as quick, he rushed forward again and tried to lift up the body, but directly he raised his shoulders, he knew that the man was dead. Dead. He lowered him down gently. He stood over him without fear or any other feeling, almost indifferent, far away, as it were. And then he made another start, and if he had not kept Mrs. Anthony always in his mind, he would have let out a yell for help. He staggered to her cabin door, and as it was, his call for "Captain Anthony" burst out of him much too loud, but he made a great effort of self-control. "I am waiting for my orders, sir," he said outside that door distinctly, in a steady tone. It was very still in there, still as death. Then he heard a shuffle of feet and the captain's voice. "All right, coming." He leaned his back against the bulkhead, as you see a drunken man sometimes propped up against a wall, half doubled up. In that attitude the captain found him when he came out, pulling the door to after him quickly. At once Anthony let his eyes run all over the cabin. Powell, without a word, clutched his forearm, led him round the end of the table, and began to justify himself. "I couldn't stop him," he whispered shakily. "He was too quick for me. He drank it up and fell down." But the captain was not listening. He was looking down at Mr. Smith, thinking perhaps that it was a mere chance his own body was not lying there. They did not want to speak. They made signs to each other with their eyes. The captain grasped Powell's shoulder as if in a vice, and glanced at Mrs. Anthony's cabin door, and it was enough. He knew that the young man understood him. Rather, silence, silence for ever about this. Their very glances became stealthy. Powell looked from the body to the door of the dead man's stateroom. The captain nodded and let him go, and then Powell crept over, hooked the door open, and crept back with fearful glances towards Mrs. Anthony's cabin. They stooped over the corpse. Captain Anthony lifted up the shoulders. Mr. Powell shuddered. I'll never forget that interminable journey across the saloon, step by step, holding our breath. For part of the way, the drawn half of the curtain concealed us from view had Mrs. Anthony opened her door, but I didn't draw a free breath till after we laid the body down on the swinging cot. The reflection of the saloon light left most of the cabin in the shadow. Mr. Smith's rigid, extended body looked shadowy too, shadowy and alive. You know he always carried himself as stiff as a poker. We stood by the cot as though waiting for him to make a sign that he wanted to be left alone. The captain threw his arm over my shoulder and said in my very ear, "The steward will find him in the morning." I made no answer. It was for him to say. It was, perhaps, the best way. There's no use talking about my thoughts. They were not concerned with myself, nor yet with that old man who terrified me more now than when he was alive. Him whom I pitied was the captain. He whispered, "I am certain of you, Mr. Powell. You had better go on deck now. As to me—" and I saw him raise his hands to his head as if distracted. But his last words before we stole out of that cabin stick to my mind with the very tone of his mutter, to himself, not to me. "No, no, I am not going to stumble now over that corpse." End of Part 2, Chapter 6, Section 3. Part 2, Chapter 6, Section 4 of Chance by Joseph Conrad. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Read by Peter Dann. Chance, Part 2, Chapter 6, Section 4. "This is what our Mr. Powell had to tell me," said Marlow, changing his tone. I was glad to learn that Flora de Barrall had been saved from that sinister shadow at least falling upon her path. We sat silent then, my mind running on the end of de Barrall, on the irresistible pressure of imaginary griefs, crushing conscience, scruples, prudence, under their ever-expanding volume, on the sombre and venomous irony in the obsession which had mastered that old man. "Well," I said. "The steward found him," Mr. Powell roused himself. "He went in there with a cup of tea at 5 and of course dropped it. I was on watch again. He reeled up to me on deck, pale as death. I had been expecting it, and yet I could hardly speak. 'Go and tell the captain quietly,' I managed to say. He ran off, muttering, 'My God, my God!' and I'm hanged if he didn't get hysterical while trying to tell the captain and start screaming in the saloon, 'Fully dressed! Dead! Fully dressed!' Mrs. Anthony ran out, of course, but she didn't get hysterical. Franklin, who was there too, told me that she hid her face on the captain's breast, and then he went out and left them there. It was days before Mrs. Anthony was seen on deck. The first time I spoke to her, she gave me a hand and said, 'My poor father was quite fond of you, Mr. Powell.' She started wiping her eyes, and I fled to the other side of the deck. One would like to forget all this had ever come near her. But clearly he could not, because after lighting his pipe he began musing aloud. Very strong stuff it must have been. I wonder where he got it. It could hardly be at a common chemist. Well, he had it from somewhere. A mere pinch it must have been, no more. "I have my theory," observed Marlow, "which to a certain extent does away with the added horror of a coldly premeditated crime. Chance had stepped in there too. It was not Mr. Smith who obtained the poison, it was the great de Barrall, and it was not meant for the obscure magnanimous conqueror Flora de Barrall. It was meant for the notorious financier whose enterprises had nothing to do with magnanimity. He had his physician in his days of greatness. I even seem to remember that the man was called at the trial on some small point or other. I can imagine that de Barrall went to him when he saw, as he could hardly help seeing, the possibility of a triumph of envious rivals, a heavy sentence. I doubt if for love or even for money, but I think possibly from pity that man provided him with what Mr. Powell called strong stuff. From what Powell saw of the very act, I'm fairly certain it must have been contained in a capsule, and that he had it about him on the last day of his trial, perhaps secured by a stitch in his waistcoat pocket. He didn't use it. Why? Did he think of his child at the last moment? Was it want of courage? We can't tell. But he found it in his clothes when he came out of jail. It had escaped investigation, if there was any. Chance had armed him. And chance alone, the chance of Mr. Powell's life, forced him to turn the abominable weapon against himself. I imparted my theory to Mr. Powell, who accepted it at once as, in a sense, favourable to the father of Mrs. Anthony. Then he waved his hand. "Don't let us think of it." I acquiesced, and very soon he observed dreamily, "I was with Captain and Mrs. Anthony sailing all over the world for near on 6 years, almost as long as Franklin." "Oh, yes. What about Franklin?" I asked. Powell smiled. "He left the Ferndale a year or so afterwards, and I took his place. Captain Anthony recommended him for a command. You don't think Captain Anthony would chuck a man aside like an old glove? But of course Mrs. Anthony did not like him very much. I don't think she ever let out a whisper against him, but Captain Anthony could read her thoughts." And again Powell seemed to lose himself in the past. I asked, for suddenly the vision of the Fines passed through my mind, "Any children?" Powell gave a start. No, never had any children," and again subsided, puffing at his short briar pipe. "Where are they now?" I inquired next, as if anxious to ascertain that all Fine's fears had been misplaced and vain, as our fears often are, that there were no undesirable cousins for his dear girls, no danger of intrusion on their spotless home. Powell looked round at me slowly, his pipe smouldering in his hand. "Don't you know?" he uttered in a deep voice. "Know what?" "That the Ferndale was lost this 4 years ago or more. Sunk. Collision. And Captain Anthony went down with her." "You don't say so!" I cried, quite affected, as if I had known Captain Anthony personally. Was Was Mrs. Anthony lost too?" "You might as well ask if I was lost," Mr. Powell rejoined so testily as to surprise me. "You see me here, don't you?" He was quite huffy, but noticing my wondering stare, he smoothed his ruffled plumes, and, in a musing tone, "Yes, good men go out as if there was no use for them in the world. It seems as if there were things that, as the Turks say, are written, or else fate has a try and sometimes misses its mark. You remember that close shave we had of being run down at night I told you of, my first voyage with them? This go it was just at dawn, a flat calm and a fog thick enough to slice with a knife, only there were no explosives on board. I was on deck, and I remember the cursed murderous thing looming up alongside, and Captain Anthony, we were both on deck, calling out, 'Good God, what's this? Shout for all hands, pal, to save themselves. There's no dynamite on board now. I'm going to get the wife.' I yelled, all the watch on deck yelled. Crash!" Mr. Powell gasped at the recollection. "It was a Belgian Green Star liner, the Westland," he went on, "commanded by one of those stop-for-nothing skippers. Flaherty was his name, and I hope he will die without absolution. She cut half through the old Ferndale, and after the blow there was a silence like death. Next I heard the captain back on deck shouting, 'Set your engines, slow ahead,' and a howl of 'Yes, yes' answering him from her forecastle, and then a whole crowd of people up there began making a row in the fog. They were throwing ropes down to us in dozens, I must say. I and the captain fastened one of them under Mrs. Anthony's arms. I remember she had a sort of dim smile on her face. 'Haul up carefully,' I shouted to the people on the steamer's deck. 'You've got a woman on that line.' The captain saw her landed up there safe, and then we made a rush round our decks to see no one was left behind. As we got back, the captain says, 'Here she's gone at last, pal, the dear old thing, run down at sea.' 'Indeed she is gone,' I said, 'but it might have been worse. Shin up this rope, sir, for God's sake. I will steady it for you.' 'What are you thinking about?' he says angrily. 'It isn't my turn. Up with you.' These were the last words he ever spoke on earth, I suppose. I knew he meant to be the last to leave his ship, so I swarmed up as quick as I could, and those damned lunatics up there grab at me from above, lug me in, drag me along aft through the row and the riot of the silliest excitement I ever did see. Somebody hails from the bridge, 'Have you got them all on board?' and a dozen silly asses start yelling all together, 'All saved! All saved!' And then that accursed Irishman on the bridge, with me roaring, 'No, no!' till I thought my head would burst, rings his engines astern. He rings the engines astern, I fighting like mad to make myself heard. And of course I saw tears, a shower of them, fall down Mr. Powell's face. His voice broke. The Ferndale went down like a stone, and Captain Anthony went down with her, the finest man's soul that ever left a sailor's body. I raved like a maniac, like a devil, with a lot of fools crowding round me and asking, 'Aren't you the captain?' 'I wasn't fit to tie the shoestrings of the man you have drowned,' I screamed at them. Well, well, I could see for myself that it was no good lowering a boat. You couldn't have seen her alongside. No use. And only think, Marlow, it was I who had to go and tell Mrs. Anthony. They had taken her down below somewhere, first-class saloon. I had to go and tell her. That Flaherty, God forgive him, comes to me as white as a sheet. 'I think you are the proper person.' God forgive him. I wish to die 100 times. A lot of kind ladies, passengers, were chattering excitedly around Mrs. Anthony, a real parrot house. The ship's doctor went before me. He whispers right and left, and then there falls a sudden hush. Yes, I wished myself dead, but Mrs. Anthony was a brick." Here Mr. Powell fairly burst into tears. "No one could help loving Captain Anthony. I leave you to imagine what he was to her. Yet before the week was out, it was she who was helping me to pull myself together." "Is Mrs. Anthony in England now?" I asked after a while. He wiped his eyes without any false shame. "Oh, yes." He began to look for matches, and while diving for the box under the table added, "And not very far from here either. That little village up there, you know." "No, really? Oh, I see." Mr. Powell smoked austerely, very detached. But I could not let him off like this. The sly beggar! So this was the secret of his passion for sailing about the river, the reason of his fondness for that creek. "And I suppose," I said, "that you are still as enthusiastic as ever, eh?" "If I were you, I would just mention my enthusiasm to Mrs. Anthony. Why not?" He caught his falling pipe neatly. But if what the French call effarement was ever expressed on a human countenance, it was on this occasion, testifying to his modesty, his sensibility, and his innocence. He looked afraid of somebody overhearing my audacious, almost sacrilegious hint, as if there had not been 1.5 miles of lonely marshland and dykes between us and the nearest human habitation. And then perhaps he remembered the soothing fact, for he allowed a gleam to light up his eyes, like the reflection of some inward fire tended in the sanctuary of his heart by a devotion as pure as that of any vestal. It flashed and went out. He smiled a bashful smile, sighed. "Bah, foolishness! You ought to know better," he said, more sad than annoyed. "But I forgot that you never knew Captain Anthony," he added indulgently. I reminded him that I knew Mrs. Anthony even before he, an old friend now, had ever set eyes on her. And as he told me that Mrs. Anthony had heard of our meetings, I wondered whether she would care to see me. Mr. Powell volunteered no opinion then, but next time we lay in the creek, he said, "She will be very pleased. You had better go to-day." The afternoon was well advanced before I approached the cottage. The amenity of a fine day in its decline surrounded me with a beneficent, a calming influence. I felt it in the silence of the shady lane, in the pure air, in the blue sky. It is difficult to retain the memory of the conflicts, miseries, temptations, and crimes of men's self-seeking existence when one is alone with the charming serenity of the unconscious nature. Breathing the dreamless peace around the picturesque cottage I was approaching, it seemed to me that it must reign everywhere, over all the globe of water and land, and in the hearts of all the dwellers on this earth. Flora came down to the garden to meet me, no longer the perversely tempting, sorrowful wisp of white mist drifting in the complicated, bad dream of existence. Neither did she look like a forsaken elf. I stammered out stupidly, "Again in the country, Mrs. She was very good, returned the pressure of my hand, but we were slightly embarrassed. Then we laughed a little. Then we became grave. I am no lover of daybreaks. You know how thin, equivocal is the light of the dawn. But she was now her true self. She was like a fine, tranquil afternoon, and not so very far advanced either. A woman not much over 30, with a dazzling complexion and a little colour, a lot of hair, a smooth brow, a fine chin, and only the eyes of the Flora of the old days, absolutely unchanged. In the room into which she led me we found a Miss Somebody, I didn't catch the name, an unobtrusive, even an indistinct middle-aged person in black, a companion, all very proper. She came and went, and even sat down at times in the room, but a little apart, with some sewing. By the time she had brought in a lighted lamp, I had heard all the details which really matter in this story. Between me and her, who was once Flora de Barrall, the conversation was not likely to keep strictly to the weather. The lamp had a rosy shade, and its glow wreathed her in perpetual blushes, made her appear wonderfully young as she sat before me in a deep, high-backed armchair. I asked, "Tell me what it is you said in that famous letter which so upset Mrs. Fine, and caused little Fine to interfere in this offensive manner." "It was simply crude," she said earnestly. "I was feeling reckless, and I wrote recklessly. I knew she would disapprove, and I wrote foolishly. It was the echo of her own stupid talk. I said that I did not love her brother, but that I had no scruples whatever in marrying him." She paused, hesitating. Then, with a shy half-laugh, "I really believed I was selling myself, Mr. Marlow, and I was proud of it. What I suffered afterwards I couldn't tell you, because I only discovered my love for my poor Roderick through agonies of rage and humiliation. I came to suspect him of despising me, but I could not put it to the test because of my father. No, I would not have been too proud, but I had to spare poor papa's feelings. Roderick was perfect, but I felt as though I were on the rack and not allowed even to cry out. Papa's prejudice against Roderick was my greatest grief. It was distracting. It frightened me. Oh, I've been miserable. That night when my poor father died suddenly, I'm certain they had some sort of discussion about me, but I did not want to hold out any longer against my own heart. I could not. She stopped short, then, impulsively. Truth will out, Mr. Marlow. Yes, I said. She went on musingly. Sorrow and happiness were mingled at first, like darkness and light. For months I lived in a dusk of feelings, but it was quiet, it was warm. Again she paused, then, going back in her thoughts, No, there was no harm in that letter. It was simply foolish. What did I know of life then? Nothing. But Mrs. Vine ought to have known better. She wrote a letter to her brother a little later. Years afterwards, Roderick allowed me to glance at it. I found in it this sentence: For years I tried to make a friend of that girl, but I warn you once more that she has the nature of a heartless adventuress. Adventuress, repeated Flora slowly. So be it. I've had a fine adventure. It was fine, then, I said, interested. The finest in the world. Only think, I loved and I was loved, untroubled, at peace, without remorse, without fear. All the world, all life were transformed for me. And how much I have seen, how good people were to me. Roderick was so much liked everywhere. Yes, I have known kindness and safety. The most familiar things appeared lighted up with a new light, clothed with a loveliness I had never suspected. The sea itself. You are a sailor, you have lived your life on it. But do you know how beautiful it is, how strong, how charming, how friendly, how mighty? I listened, amazed and touched. She was silent only a little while. It was too good to last. But nothing can rob me of it now. Don't think that I repine. I am not even sad now. Yes, I have been happy. But I remember also the time when I was unhappy, beyond endurance, beyond desperation. Yes, you remember that. And later on, too. There was a time on board the Ferndale when the only moments of relief I knew were when I made Mr. Powell talk to me a little on the poop. You like him, don't you? Excellent fellow, I said warmly. You see him often? Of course, I hardly know another soul in the world. I am alone. And he has plenty of time on his hands. His aunt died a few years ago. He's doing nothing, I believe. He is fond of the sea, I remarked. He loves it. He seems to have given it up, she murmured. I wonder why. She remained silent. Perhaps it is because he loves something else better, I went on. Come, Mrs. Anthony, don't let me carry away from here the idea that you are a selfish person, hugging the memory of your past happiness like a rich man his treasure, forgetting the poor at the gate. I rose to go, for it was getting late. She got up in some agitation and went out with me into the fragrant darkness of the garden. She detained my hand for a moment, and then, in the very voice of the Flora of old days, with the exact intonation, showing the old mistrust, the old doubt of herself, the old scar of the blow received in childhood, pathetic and funny, she murmured, "Do you think it possible that he could care for me?" "Just ask him yourself. You are brave." "Oh, I'm brave enough," she said with a sigh. "Then do. For if you don't, you'll be wronging that patient man cruelly." I departed, leaving her dumb. Next day, seeing Powell making preparations to go ashore, I asked him to give my regards to Mrs. Anthony. He promised he would. "Listen, Powell," I said, "we got to know each other by chance?" "Oh, quite," he admitted, adjusting his hat. "And the science of life consists in seizing every chance that presents itself," I pursued. "Do you believe that?" "Gospel truth," he declared innocently. "Well, don't forget it." "Oh, I don't expect now anything to present itself," he said, jumping ashore. He didn't turn up at high water. I set my sail, and just as I had cast off from the bank round the black barn in the dusk, two figures appeared and stood silent, indistinct. "Is that you, Powell?" I hailed. "And Mrs. Anthony," his voice came impressively through the silence of the great marsh. "I am not sailing tonight. I have to see Mrs. Anthony home." "Then I must even go alone," I cried. Flora's voice wished me bon voyage in a most friendly but tremulous tone. "You shall hear from me before long," shouted Powell suddenly, just as my boat had cleared the mouth of the creek. "This was yesterday," added Marlow, lolling in the armchair lazily. "I haven't heard yet, but I expect to hear any moment. What on earth are you grinning at in this sarcastic manner? I am not afraid of going to church with a friend. Hang it all, for all my belief in chance, I'm not exactly a pagan." End of Chance by Joseph Conrad.